Hello, everybody, and welcome to this conversation at the Institute on Religion and Democracy here in Washington. Welcome to all of you who are here physically and all of you who are watching online. I am Mark Tooley, president of the Institute on Religion and Democracy, which is a Christian think tank dealing with the public witness of churches in America and advocating for traditional theology and beliefs in the churches and in society. We're delighted to host this particular event dealing with transgender issues in society, and very grateful to my friend Emily Cow, and who's also a board member of our organization with Alliance Defending Freedom, to bring together this very distinguished panel discussing these issues theoretically and personally, especially in terms of how the church should address them. Even some of our best churches and well-intentioned churches don't often have the experience and knowledge to address these issues thoughtfully and effectively. So again, thank you for joining this conversation, and Emily will chair this meeting from here on. So thank you, Emily.
Thanks, Mark. Thank you so much to Institute on Religion and Democracy for hosting this event. I'm going to just go ahead and introduce our first panelist, and then I will introduce each of the panelists before they speak. So our first panelist is Grace Duncan, and she is a representative of the Changed Movement. She's going to share about her personal experience with gender ideology, and then we'll have some time to have question and answer with Grace. So Grace, thank you so much for joining us.
Yes, absolutely.
Please go ahead.
Sure, thank you. So at the very early age of like 3 or 4, I believed I was born into the wrong body. I felt I should have been a boy. And I grew up with that feeling that I was continually in the wrong body. When I looked in the mirror, what I saw didn't match what my body said. I was born into a dysfunctional home. My dad was very verbally and emotionally abusive to my mom. And so as I observed that, here's my mom, who's supposed to be my example, being a victim. And then there's my dad, who's very, he was just an abuser. And I didn't have the tools at that young of age to go, my dad's a jerk and my mom's a victim. And so I looked at that and I'm like, I don't want to grow up to be that, because that's not safe. But I don't want to be that man either. So I made a vow at a very young age that I'm going to be the man my dad is not. Now, from the abuse, I took away 3 lies: that women are weak, women are hated, and women are vulnerable. Why would I want that? That is not a safe outcome. So as I continued through, I always had this vision that I would become a man. And I lived that way. Now, at the age of 10 and 12, between the ages of 10 and 12, I was molested by a family member, which kind of cemented those 3 lies: that women are weak, women are vulnerable, and women are hated. So with that vision in mind, finally at the age of 19, it was just too much. I was desperate to get out of this body. So I started hormone treatments and moved in with a single family, and changed my name to Keith and started on the hormone treatments. 2 weeks after moving in with this family, it was a single mom. She had 2 girls, and they were believers, and so they kept asking me to go to church with them. Now, I was raised in a Lutheran home, nothing wrong with that, but I didn't really know the Lord. I joke and I say I was a God stalker because I knew about God, but I didn't really know God. And so I go to this church, and not only are they preaching about God, but they're teaching about Jesus. And I'm like, well, who's Jesus? I don't know this guy. He sounds pretty cool. I think I want to. So there was altar call that was given, and I went down and I received the Lord as my Savior. And I got up the next morning and there wasn't a change. And I'm like, maybe it didn't work. So the next 2 Sundays, the next 2 altar calls, I went down, accepted the Lord as my Savior. And the pastor pulled me aside and he said, I just want you to know the first time you did this, it took, okay? You're saved. And I'm like, okay. But even after the 3rd time, I got up and I'm just like, I don't know. I don't feel any different, because I expected to hear what you're doing is wrong from the Lord. And I'm really new in my faith. How would I discern the voice of the Lord? How would I know that will? So because I didn't hear anything, I thought the Lord was okay. He's okay with my life. So I continued on, got a job as a man, and my very first job, and my dad learned where I was. And so he came in and he said, that's not a man that's working for you, that's my daughter. boom, I'm fired from my job. And at the same time, there was a lady that I went to church with who overheard the conversation, went and told the pastors, here's the deal. So I get confronted by the church I get saved in, and they asked me, we're hearing rumors about you. Who are you? Who are you really? And I said to them, I'm a man who used to be a woman. And they said, we love you. You just can't go to church here. So I left and continued my life as a man, still not feeling any conviction. Started dating women, dated a girl for about 5 years, and then eventually we broke up. And upon that breakup, let me back up just a minute. The girl I was dating for 5 years, we started going to church together, and I became part of the orchestra. I saw a need for a French horn player, so I'm like, hey, sign me up. After breaking up with her, I jumped into an immediate rebound relationship. And in doing so, it was a year long, and in that year-long relationship, I fell into a very deep pornography addiction. I'm talking deep. It was like a drug of choice for me. I saw it every day. I felt like I would go through withdrawals if I didn't see it. One morning, in dating this girl in this rebound relationship, I woke up and I was like, oh my gosh, she's my mom and I'm my dad. I was treating her as my dad treated my mom. And I'm like, I cannot be that man. So I broke up with her. And one night on my way to orchestra practice after breaking up with her, the Lord called to me. And he said, will you now? Will you now? And I'm like, So I take this inventory of my life and I'm like, I don't have anything in the way. I don't have any reason not to. So I said, yes, Lord, I will. Well, it was about 3 months later that I realized that night when I said yes to the Lord, he delivered me from my pornography addiction. Totally. So I continued on as my life as a man in the church, but now I began to open my heart and my life everywhere to the Lord. Next thing I know, I'm in the junior high, and I have a group of small boys, or junior high boys. I'm also leading a men's Bible study, and I'm involved in leadership in the single adults as well as the college age group. I was just everywhere I thought the Lord would be, that's where I was. And I walked this way for 4 years. Now the church had no idea that I was, came from being a woman. And then, there were some circumstances that happened, and I was confronted at the church. I came home from a junior high retreat, and the Lord had given me a spiritual dad, and he came up to me and he said, can I talk to you? And I'm like, oh, I think I know what this is. And so I was sure. So we go behind the sanctuary, and there sits the pastor of the college age group, and I thought, I'm going to be confronted. So I sit down, and the pastor says to me, we're hearing rumors about you, and we just want to know, who are you? Who are you really? Same question. But this time I responded with, I'm a woman living as a man, which that was the truth. And as I spoke the truth, the Holy Spirit went, and it blew into me. And I realized in that moment, I have to go back to being a woman. I have to go back to being a woman. It was just so clear to me. And so I looked at the pastor and I said, what do you think I should do? Not telling him anything that I just realized. And he's like, well, you could, how about you, I don't know what you should do. So I told him I have to go back to being a woman, and I need to step down from the ministries I'm involved with, and I need to tell him why. And he's like, okay, you know what? I'll make those appointments for you, and I'll be in those appointments with you. And so he did. So the next 2 weeks I spent stepping down. I lost my job. I went in Monday morning to my job, and I got fired. I don't even know why. I mean, it had nothing to do with just what just happened at church, but I knew it was the Lord. He was clearing the way, and at that point I was living in Washington State, and I moved back to Oregon, and I began a program with the Portland Fellowship called Taking Back Ground. So it was this discipleship program, which I began to work through my stuff, if you will. It was a 5-year period that I did that, and at the end of that 5 years, I was finally able to come to a place, mostly because the hormones had worn off the effects, so I could pass as a woman, because that was a big deal to me. I didn't want to start living as a woman, and people are all like, are you a man trying to be a woman? I really wanted to pass as the woman God created me to be. So I changed my name back, started walking that out, and then I became part of the ministry team at the Portland Fellowship, and also I met Elizabeth, and then in that, I'm like, I don't understand this connection. Well, then AB 2943 legislation came out where they were calling it consumer fraud, meaning if you go to therapy wanting to change, that's not possible. So with the bill, it was a network of people that came together to put together their stories as far as, yes, we can change. They took it down to the Capitol, said, hey, here we are, we're changed. So I continued to partner with them, and they eventually gave me the position of the Director of Gender Advocacy. And I'm also on staff, I guess, with the Portland Fellowship as their women's leader and transgender ministry leader. And so I lived as a man for 11 years, and I came out of that 29 years ago. My last truth to give you is I'm just not the man I used to be.
Well, thank you so much, Kathy Grace, for sharing your testimony with us. Just a little bit of context, some of the things you mentioned. You referenced Elizabeth Woning with
Yes.
the Changed
Yes.
movement, and that is a Christian ministry
Yes.
that helps people who are struggling with same-sex attraction and gender dysphoria, right?
That's correct.
And then you also mentioned the bill AB 2943,
Yes.
which was a bill in California that was introduced that would have banned counseling
Correct.
for anyone who was struggling with same-sex attraction and gender dysphoria. It would not allow them, as you say, to change, and actually really to accept themselves. In your case, accept yourself as a woman.
Right.
So do you have any advice that you want to offer to churches, to pastors, to ministry leaders to help equip them to help people who are struggling with gender dysphoria?
Sure. So the first thing I want pastors to understand is that it's not a sexual issue. I know it's being treated like that, as a sexual issue, diagnosis as sexual issues. However, it's a relational issue. And in those 5 years of walking that out, the Lord kept pushing me into relationships, which actually, in that relational brokenness brought healing. Because I knew I was loved. We have to understand, too, what we see at the surface of what they're dealing with is actually fruit of a deeper woundedness. Deeper issues are going on. There's legitimate needs that went unmet. And so now through the lifestyle, they're trying to get those met. It didn't happen for them. I also want to encourage pastors not to be afraid of this issue. I know it's kind of scary. It seems like it's a sexual thing, but if you look at it through the eyes of, this is a relational issue, and these are the things I can, rejection, abandonment, abuse. Abuse is a big one. What are the messages that they got through their childhood trauma? A lot of it comes through trauma. They took away messages. I had women were hated, women were weak, and women were vulnerable. And I had to look at those and realize I don't have to be weak. I'm not vulnerable, and I'm not hated. But that also came through embracing my identity as the Lord led, working those things out. Also, in the pastors not being afraid, they need to do their research. They need to understand the underlying issues of there's gender dysphoria, which starts at a very early age, and now there's another label out there called rapid onset gender dysphoria. And my opinion, this is my opinion, is that the rapid onset gender dysphoria is more gender confusion. Starts at puberty, and by the end of puberty, they're like, no, I really do want to be who I am. So they go through this gender confusion, but they still have underlying issues as far as who they are. And I think in the church, gender identity and sexuality needs to be taught. And it needs to be taught for them to help them understand who they are in Christ. Because I didn't know who I was. Yes, I loved the Lord, but I didn't understand who I was. And it was as I began to look at those issues, those broken things, that I realized being a woman is good. It's good. I was created on purpose for a purpose. So it's understanding the issues that are out there, not being afraid to do the research, not being afraid to come alongside. You may feel like, I don't know what to do, but the Lord does. The Lord knows them the best and loves them the most. And so He's going to be able to give you the things to walk with this person and to provide a safe place for them.
Thank you, Kathy Grace. Now I want to turn to the biblical and legal responses to gender theory. Before we get into that, I just want to say a word about what gender theory is. So gender theory denies the truth that we are created male and female, and it substitutes for biological sex, it substitutes this new category of gender identity. And then it says that gender identity is totally subjective, it's self-determined, and that the category of gender identity is actually how you determine biological sex. And so that is wreaking havoc in our law, in our culture, and it is a very serious threat, particularly to children. As you mentioned, rapid onset gender dysphoria is a phenomenon in our society where especially girls are suddenly starting to experience a lot of gender confusion. A recent study at the University of Pittsburgh found that 1 in 10 high school students now express a gender identity or gender confusion that doesn't align with their biological sex. And so we are going to hear from Reverend Jim Supp, who is a senior teaching pastor at Reston Bible Church. Jim, you have really taken a very proactive attitude to introduce discussion in your church about gender ideology, and particularly you've tried to focus on equipping parents. So tell us about why you made that decision and how it's going.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you. Thank you for having me. So I've been a pastor for 25 years. Prior to becoming a pastor, I worked in inpatient psychiatric health care for about a decade. And during that time, as our culture began to loosen and discard just the basic guardrails of the way we should behave from a Judeo-Christian standards of morals and ethics kind of thing, especially teenagers who were on the fringe, like in the psychiatric facilities that I worked in, began to kind of deviate from what would be considered traditional. Now, again, homosexuality and things of this sort have existed for thousands of years. But really the acceptability and kind of the movement in a direction. So for example, in the mid-'80s, it was unacceptable. We encouraged teenagers who were struggling with sexuality issues to not share about that in their group therapies. So the one thing they were told, you didn't have to share it there. Because we knew that they would be given a bad time about it when they weren't in group therapy with the rest of the students. And by the mid-'90s, we started to see a significant shift where it became kind of in vogue for girls to say that they were bisexual, never the boys at that point. And you kind of see, I started to see this kind of the movement, the loosening of basic biblical structures for who we are as men and women. So as I moved into ministry, really just kind of projecting forward, I felt like the Lord has given me sort of this sense of evaluating culture and seeing where things are going. Several years ago, when the whole discussion on transgender ideology and all of that started to kind of hit the scene, I started talking to our youth ministry in particular and said, this is coming. And I started sounding the alarm a couple of years ago on this and saying, we need to prepare. This is coming for us. It is coming for our children. And so I had the women on our youth team read Irreversible Damage and some of the other things like that. And so ultimately, one of the big precipitants was I was the pastor on call one day, and I got a call from a young man who lives out of town. He didn't want to talk to anybody in his local community, and how he came to our church, I don't even know. But he called and said, I'm a follower of Jesus, but if I identify as transgender and go down that path, will I lose my salvation? And I said for 30 years, because I worked in a psychiatric facility, nothing. I've heard it all before. I'm never shocked by anything, and until I got that call, and I was like, "Oh my goodness, I don't know how do I manage talking with this man?" And so I knew of Walt Heyer. I knew of some of his material. I knew his story, and so I went to Walt's website, and it said, "Email Walt." So I'm like, "Okay, sure." So I emailed Walt, and he got back with me within 10 minutes, and so we started this dialogue just about this whole journey. And my greatest alarm is, yes, what's happening in culture, but the unprepared church, capital C. The church is completely unprepared. The church feels like we're okay, our families are okay, our kids are okay. Parents have so little awareness of what their kids are seeing online. And the more rapid onset gender dysphoria, a lot of the fuel to that is social media. A young person comes out and says, I'm transgender. Well, suddenly they've never experienced more affirmation, more support any time in their entire life. And for a struggling teenager, suddenly, well, okay. And so there's this embrace, specifically because of some of those things. So I've been sharing this with our team for quite some time. And a month or two ago, we had Walt Heyer come to our church to present. Some of you might be aware of a woman by the name of Maria Keffler, who wrote a book called Desist, Detrans, Detox. Specifically, it's basically a handbook for parents whose kids walk through the front door and say, I'm transgender. How do you manage that? And she does a brilliant writing on how to navigate those waters. And then Sharon Supp from the ADF, my wife, really came in speaking about some of the legal elements, the parental rights issues. How should we see this from a parental rights perspective? And so it was really pretty significant. And we're continuing to lean into this. I believe, unfortunately, we invited dozens of churches to participate in this event, and no one took us up on that. And I'm like, pastors, this is coming. It's going to show up in your church too. You're going to have a parent in tears who's coming to you saying, my 16-year-old is demanding hormone therapy. What are we going to do? And are you prepared for that? And I submit to you that you're not. And so our goal has really been to really begin to educate pastors, parents, families, begin to equip with tools. Like, what do we do? How do we navigate this? What are the conversations that we should be having? And then really empower them. Say, this isn't a political issue. This is a moral issue. It's related to what the Scripture says. God created us male and female. That's pretty basic from chapter 1 of the book, right? And we want to help empower pastors to say, this doesn't need to be controversial. You don't need to be afraid. You need to be loving. And rarely have I gotten the response from my congregation that says, we are going to embrace anybody who walks through that door. We don't have to agree with the decisions that they've made. We are going to love them. We're going to preach the gospel to them. And if somebody walks through our door, unlike Grace's experience, that's to say, this is a place where we can walk with you and help you and be on a journey together to sort through how God, it's not my job to change you, it's my job to love you, it's God's job to do whatever changing needs to be made. And so that's really our passion, and my passion is to specifically help parents, but then pastors who are being blindsided by this every day of the week. So.
Thank you, Jim. You referenced Walt Heyer, our friend, and Walt, for those of you who don't know, Walt formerly lived as a woman for 8 years. When he did go to a church, he experienced a lot of rejection initially, but then he later found a church and a pastor who walked alongside him as he became reconciled with with being a male. And he now has a website called Sex Change Regret, where he's collected the stories of many people who have detransitioned, who are now living living comfortably as male or female. And now I want to turn to my colleague, Rachel Sutoris. So Rachel is legal counsel with our Center for Conscience Initiatives. And just a word about Alliance Defending Freedom. Alliance Defending Freedom is the largest legal organization in the world that protects life, marriage and the family, religious liberty, free speech, and parental rights. And this issue of gender theory, not only does it really threaten children and parental rights, there are also free speech and religious freedom implications, and ADF represents several counselors and other clients who are challenging some of these restrictions on speech. So Rachel, please go ahead and tell us a little bit about the law on speaking about these issues.
Yeah, I would love to. Thank you for having me. So I think there's around 4 main issues and areas where we're looking at counseling regulations and counseling speech bans, really is what we're calling them. So the first thing I think that counselors and other people who are speaking on these issues should be aware of are the counseling regulations as regulating your profession at the beginning. So every professional organization has to follow a set of rules, and when you're becoming a counselor, there's the regulations you follow through the state to be licensed with the state. And so there's third parties that are creating these code of ethics rules, and there's several states that are now incorporating these third parties' ethics rules and how they regulate the profession within the state. And which wouldn't be a problem, but the American Counseling Association has created their code of ethics in reaction to one of our cases that came down favorably. There was a counseling student in Michigan who wanted to refer out counseling a same-sex individual who was in a same-sex relationship. And she was fine counseling that individual, but she didn't want to speak on the relationship, and because she believes marriage is between a man and a woman. So she referred that person out. And after she did that, there was a complaint from the university, but because the American Counseling Association allowed referrals for these types of issues, she was protected. So the American Counseling Association then turned around and barred any value-based referral. So now counselors in these 19 different states that have incorporated this type of ethics rules are not allowed to refer out because of their religious beliefs. So how this kind of would play out in real life is Iowa is a state that has very explicitly incorporated these code of ethics rules. So if you're a counselor there and a same-sex couple comes to you for premarital counseling, and you believe marriage is between a man and a woman and you would like to refer them to someone else, and you do that, then that couple could then file a complaint online, and the board would then investigate it and could even revoke that person's license. And so these are the types of counseling regulations that we are working on. We are trying to find clients and really kind of take down some of these laws that states have incorporated. So that's the first area, is really the regulation of the counseling profession. But the second one would be public accommodation laws. And in this idea is the idea that there's, like, sex is now being redefined to include sexual orientation and gender identity, and not just male and female as it's normally been defined as, in attempts to create additional protections for this group of people. So in about 29 states and 330 municipalities now, they have redefined the word sex to be sexual orientation and gender identity in these public spaces. So what a public accommodation is kind of varies state by state. Really, it could be very broad as to what is considered, but it's generally, if you're holding yourself open to the public, then you're a public accommodation. So counseling services could fall under these rules if it's a very broad interpretation of who do you serve, and thus it would be kind of the same relation as the last instance I gave, the example of a same-sex couple coming for premarital counseling. You couldn't turn them away because of their sexual orientation. And one of the ones that's the third area where I feel like there's a lot of talk, and probably a lot of you are familiar with them, is reparative therapy bans or conversion therapy, sexual orientation change efforts, really just a lot of words for speech bans, so talk therapy bans, and what people are allowed to say in these appointments. So you're not allowed to do anything but affirm someone's gender dysphoria, and you can't really give them the counseling that they need to get to the root issue of what's happening. So in 20 states and 100 municipalities, these have been enforced, or not enforced, but created, these reparative therapy bans. At ADF, we do have a client in Washington State who challenged this conversion therapy ban. And Brian Tingley was a marriage and family counselor for 20 years who's helped a lot of people find their human flourishing within God's design. And he challenged the Washington law because each penalty he would face $5,000 if he was going to speak in that way, and help people get to the bottom line and not just blindly affirm however they feel. And these laws are very dangerous because it's really the government stepping into a private conversation with people, and we have the right of free speech to speak in the way that we want to speak according to your religious beliefs. So unfortunately, we didn't win that case. We just lost at the Ninth Circuit, but there is better case law in the 11th Circuit where a counselor challenged a local ordinance in Boca Raton, Florida, and they ended up winning at the 11th Circuit. So now we have a lot of differing law in those two areas. So I think we're hopeful to challenge that up to the Supreme Court maybe, and to strike down some of these unconstitutional laws. I know we're in the DC, Virginia, Maryland, Metro, DMV area. So just to address the reparative therapy bans there, generally what they are geared towards minors. It's generally not adults. There have been a few instances where it's adults, like banning conversion therapy for adults, but mainly it's minors, and it's with certified licensed counselors. So biblical counselors, maybe if you are a pastor within a church and you're not charging and you're not a licensed counselor and that's not how you're operating it, you would be protected and probably be able to speak in that way. But if you kind of open yourself up to the public, you're charging, you're a licensed counselor, then you would probably fall under some of these regulations. It really does vary on, like, state by state, ordinance, local, city by city, and what the law is in those areas. And then just federally, in June, President Biden did release an executive order for a national reparative therapy ban through the Federal Trade Commission. And I think we're watching that closely to see. And I say all this, I know it's a lot of information and a lot of things, and just being aware of what's going on and what are the restrictions on your speech in a specific area. But like Emily said, ADF operates as an organization to provide resources to pastors and ministries to keep the doors open for the gospel. And so we really want to encourage pastors and ministries to reach out to us if you have a question on, am I going to be protected from this? What can be done to protect me, or what should I be doing? So that's really what I want to encourage, just to reach out to us if you do have those types of questions.
Thank you, Rachel.
Yeah.
I think it's really important to note that the church can continue to be a place where it is legally protected to speak the truth, that we are created male and female, that biblical counseling that is free, that is offered within the church, that is not covered, likely not covered under most of the laws that she talked about. And there are many, many parents who are in search of counseling that will help their child be integrated, body, mind, and soul, and not reject themselves as God has created them. So we hear a lot from parents who are looking for a counselor who will affirm their child's body, their mind, and their soul, and they can't find one. So I just wanted to mention a couple of resources that we have, particularly on parental rights. ADF has published a toolkit for parents on critical theory. You can find that on our website. It addresses gender theory, both in the context of schools and healthcare. I have, for those people who are here in the audience, I have a few of our pamphlets that link to that toolkit. We've also recently worked with 40 other organizations to launch the Promise to America's Parents, which is a roadmap for protecting parental rights at the local level, the state level, and the federal level. We have legislation that can be introduced to combat some of the legal challenges, in addition to what you mentioned with the talk therapy bans. The Biden administration has also recently introduced a redefinition of sex to include gender identity in Title IX of the 1972 Educational Amendments, and that will affect all public schools in America. It could lead to more schools treating children according to gender identity instead of biological sex without telling their parents. And we have several lawsuits on behalf of parents who have been deceived by their schools and are now challenging those policies. And one other law that is sitting on Governor Newsom's desk as we speak, SB 107 in California has just passed the legislature there. It would allow California to take temporary jurisdiction over any child who is brought into California or who runs away to California for the purpose of getting these experimental interventions through hormones and surgeries on their bodies to only change their physical appearance. So the Promise to America's Parents Coalition has just released a letter yesterday to Governor Newsom asking him to veto this law because it violates parental rights, endangers children, and also violates the jurisdictions of all other 49 states. And so with that, I want to open up our remaining time for questions from the audience. So if you have a question, you can either write it on a card that is being distributed now, or you can, if you want to just raise your hand and ask a question, that's fine too. Yes.
Hi, my name is William Roberts. I work here at IDC. I was hoping you could speak a little bit to an element of gender ideology that you've been touched on very much in your talks, and that's people who don't consider themselves to be male or female, who adopt a non-binary or non-specific gender identity, and yeah, I would love to hear you speak about that.
As far as how to help them, how to
Yeah.
address them. So I go back to the same thing. There's an underlying issue as far as why they don't want to be identified in that way. So it's kind of looking at, why don't you feel safe in identifying as either male or female? And talking, asking them about what was it like for you to grow up? What was your home life like? How did your parents treat you? Did you have siblings? Were you bullied in school? Were you pushed to one way or the other and you didn't agree with it? So it's basically becoming their friend and listening to them before we offer anything, because we really want to be able to gain their trust to have that place to speak into their life. And then it's beginning to ask the Holy Spirit, how do I help this person? How do I meet them where they're at and speak truth into that place that you can begin to have that relationship with them?
Another question that comes up a lot is the question of what pronouns to use for somebody who identifies as transgender or non-binary. What are your thoughts on that?
Sure. So I look at that as levels of relationship. If you're a parent and your child is coming home saying, "I'm a boy," and it's your daughter, I would encouraging you to not use the he pronouns, because you are affirming that lie. You're affirming the deception and you're calling it good. And for whatever reason they believe that they're now a boy, you're also, if there's trauma or hurt in that background, you're saying that trauma is also good, that's promoting that lie. So you're kind of promoting the trauma and promoting the lie. And it's also understanding we need to get some help. We need to find counseling. We need to dig into this issue to understand why you feel this way. Because again, their feelings are very strong. I get it. My feeling was very strong. And I bought the lie hook, line, and sinker. So that wall of deception was very thick. And they've probably detached somewhat from their emotions. So you may ask them, so why do you feel this way? They may not know, because they've boxed that stuff, if you will, that's brought them to this place, that pain. Or that unmet need, thinking this is the only way I can get this met. Now, if it's a friend, it's depending on your level of friendship. If they're close, you need to have that discussion with them. And parents, you need to have that discussion with your child. But looking at asking those questions, if it's a close friend, you should have that type of relationship to go, I don't understand how you got here. And and understand that even anybody who is transgender, they've been struggling with this for a while. This is not an overnight thing. So they're not going to come out overnight. But it's trying to begin to pick apart, how did you get here? Now, if it's somebody that you've just met, and they're now confiding in you, it's beginning to ask those questions to form that relationship, to begin to speak into their life. Really, it's all about relationship, because I am being in broken relationships and having that brokenness. I didn't trust anybody. Everybody was in suspicion. I'm like, can I trust you? What do you? Because my whole thing is you don't know me, you haven't lived my life. Don't try to tell me. I know who I am, right? Deception. Now, if it's somebody that you see in the church, right? Say you're a greeter and they come in and they say, "Hi, my name's Jane," and you can obviously tell this person's a Larry. It's coming next to them and saying, "Hey, glad you're here." Let them know that, "Hey, I see you. Thank you for coming today. What brought you to our church?" It's really important not to make them a project, or I'm going to tell you the truth, because honestly, they need to know that they're loved first before we offer them the truth. We have to offer them a safe space. This is a safe space. Hey, what brought you here? They may not even tell you. They're just like, "Well, I just thought I needed church." And, begin to inquire about them. Begin that question thing. Say, "I see you. I want to know more about you. Why are you here?" Wherever that conversation leads. But it's not always bringing the truth first, because that to them, to me, that was condemnation. It's like, you don't see me. You just want to hammer me with the truth, and I don't need that, because, walls up, I don't need this right now. And they'll leave. And they may never come back.
Jim, do you want to address that question too?
The specific question about
The preferred pronoun question.
Yeah, I'm in complete alignment with that. I think that I know several who work very, very hard to not use pronouns at all. Right? I mean, when you're in that situation, you don't want to bring offense if you don't have the opportunity to build the relationship, but you don't want to be speaking something that's not true. And this is a big thing in the county where we live, Loudoun County, where teachers suspended for refusing to use the wrong pronouns and so forth and so on. There's a huge flurry of activity around that, represented by ADF, this teacher. And so this discussion happens a lot. And so we really feel very strongly. I think people land in different places regarding the actual change of name, and I think there's a little bit more wiggle room on that, because obviously names can vary. But I think that when it comes to the pronouns, I would encourage people to avoid the use of them if necessary, if that opportunity for a conversation isn't really possible.
Right.
Thank you. And the case that you mentioned is for Tanner Cross, who was an elementary school teacher who protested against a policy that would have forced him to use the pronouns that align with gender identity instead of biological sex. And he spoke up at the Loudoun County School Board. And he said, I love my students, and therefore I will not tell them a lie. So I think we have time for one final question. Yes, in the back.
Yes, my name is Zach Ritz. I'm the pastor of Veritas Church in Warrenton, Virginia. Thank you guys so much for having us here today and being the face of truth there up front. So thank you so much for that, your courage and boldness. So I appreciate that. Pastor, and then also for ADF as well, I want to ask the non-relational shepherding question, and more so of for clergy, rather than just always being reactionary, like you were trying to tell them, hey, we need to get ahead of this, right? Even in the shepherding thing. What could we also do legislatively, right? Pastors used to be very much so. Religion and democracy, all these things used to go hand in hand together. We didn't see such a separation of faith, right, and the state as we were today. Almost to be confused of why would pastors even be coming and actually engaging in these conversations. What can we do on the front end? What can we do to say, like, hey, pastors, here you start thinking about a prophetic voice of truth, right? Very bold in the pulpit on a Sunday morning with conservatives sitting in front of you, right? But what does it look like to engage in some of the places that you are as well, and to join together and kind of lock arms on that front?
Do you want to speak to the counseling, and I can speak to parental rights?
Yeah, well, one of the things, that sounds great to me. I think one of the things that when you were speaking, I really made me think of too is that through ADF we also have our Church and Ministry Alliance that's not just reactionary, it's protecting you from the outset. So having access to attorneys to go through your statement of faith and your different documents to ensure that you are protected if these types of issues do come up in staffing and who you're hiring and who's going to be working within your church. That's the thing that I was thinking of. Is there others you want to speak on too?
Yes, well, thank you for that question. We are always looking to work with pastors who want to support good legislation and oppose bad legislation. So I had mentioned the Promise to America's Parents. That is a website, promisetoamericasparents.org. It lays out 10 principles for good parental rights legislation based on the ideas of government accountability, choice, and transparency. And that is not only supported by parents and by public policy organizations, it's also supported by faith leaders from different denominations, definitely including Christian pastors. And we are looking for pastors who will speak in support of good legislation and who will testify, who will be able to speak into the public square, and also to oppose the kind of dangerous legislation like I mentioned in California, and also the redefinition of sex to include gender identity in Title IX. I think right now we're seeing a lot of good legislation in the states to protect parental rights. We've seen several states pass parents' bills of rights. Congress could also play a role here in passing legislation that would codify that parental rights are fundamental rights. And right now, with some of the policies that we see from the federal government, from the Biden administration, the Department of Education, that is a direct threat to parental rights that should be addressed at the federal level, that having a state parents' bill of rights is not enough. So we are glad to come and talk in churches to provide information about parental rights, about counseling, about free speech. So again, our website is adflegal.org. And I want to thank everyone for coming in person and all of those who joined us on the live stream. I hope this has been a helpful discussion. I want to thank all of our wonderful panelists, Kathy, Grace, and Reverend Supp, and Rachel. Thank you so much for joining us today.